Gouache, 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 acrylic gouache. Hi, my name is Claire and I am a professional artist based in Melbourne, and this is the first video in what I hope is a series of videos where I review new art materials that I haven't tried before or art materials that I have used in the past. And I would like to give you guys a bit of feedback on these materials, what I think about them, how I would use them, and yeah. So in this video, which is the first video, in this video, I'm going to be reviewing the Liquitex Acrylic Gouache. Acrylic gouache. So generally speaking, gouache is a water-based paint that's very similar to watercolor. The main difference between gouache and watercolor is that gouache tends to be a lot more opaque than watercolor. A watercolor, traditionally, you use a lot of transparent washes and you try and retain the white of the paper. Where gouache, in comparison, you can paint with white paint. So you can make the paint more opaque by adding in white, and that means that you can layer colors on top of each other. So in that regard, it's a little bit more similar to acrylic painting or even oil painting, in that you can brighten up the colors as you go. You don't have to retain the white within the paper or the surface you're painting on. So traditionally, it was used more in illustration and design, and that's because it has a very flat, even matte finish to it. So it was really good for nice, clean, crisp edges on lettering, for example, or graphic design. Now that a lot of graphic design is done digitally, it's kind of, not used as much in that traditional manner, but a lot of artists do still use it. I use a lot of gouache in my sketchbooks, and I use it for just generally sketching and painting and planning. I will mention as well that this is not a sponsored post. I have purchased all of these Liquitex gouache paints of my own accord with my own money. This is just a review for those that might be interested that may not have purchased them yet. I originally purchased a little selection of basic primary colors. So I have primary blue, yellow deep, ultramarine blue, red light, primary yellow, and quinacridone magenta, and also a couple of white. So that's the color range that I have. I kind of wanted to get just a basic primary palette range with a couple of, like a cool blue, a warm blue, a cool red, cool yellow, that sort of thing, just so when I'm mixing them together, I can get a pretty big variety of colors. How does the Liquitex I'm not gonna be able to say this, acrylic gouache. How does the Liquitex acrylic gouache differ from normal gouache? So the reason why Liquitex have called this acrylic gouache as opposed to just gouache is because they have reformulated, and really it's not an exact gouache. So the Liquitex gouache, it differs from more traditional formulas because apparently it will dry permanently, and it doesn't need to be diluted with water, and it won't crack once it's dry. Now, traditional gouache is a non-permanent medium, which means that once you've finished your painting, if you get a drop of water on that painting or something splashes on it, it will reactivate and it will create a smudge. It's not permanent. So any kind of dampness or drips or wetness back onto that surface that you've painted on is going to cause the gouache to move around. Liquitex, I think they've kind of tried to mesh together acrylic paint and gouache to kind of make their own thing. Yeah, the other thing is that it doesn't need to be diluted with water, and it won't crack once dry. So the whole cracking once dry thing is another downside of traditional gouache. You're restricted to really only being able to use it on paper. You can't really use gouache on canvases or flexible surfaces, because if you apply the paint too thick, it will crack and flake off. So that's why traditionally gouache is sort of mounted and displayed in a way similar to watercolor, which is usually framed behind glass to protect it from dust and moisture. And traditional gouache is the same. So the fact that this is more of an acrylic paint type gouache means that it is a bit more flexible. So you could probably use this stuff on canvases and not have to worry so much about it cracking and flaking off. If you enjoy more sort of mixed media painting in mixed media books or mixed media journals, or sort of timber surfaces with lots of different things on it, this is probably going to be a slightly better option. These in Australia are worth, when you buy them, between about $10 to $18. It depends on where you buy them from. You can get them online at various art supply stores. And so besides those things, it's also claimed to leave no brush strokes, and you don't need to dilute it with water either, apparently. It's actually quite a runny formula, so as soon as you pour it out of the tube or out of the little container, you don't need to dilute it with water, which is interesting. So this acrylic gouache really isn't meant to be compared with, I think, traditional gouache. So it's a little bit unfair for me to say, oh, this isn't like gouache because of these reasons. Because really Liquitex has tried to produce something that is totally different to traditional gouache. But, you know, I do paint with traditional gouache. I usually use Winsor & Newton designer's gouache. So that's what I'm going to be comparing it to when I talk about using the paint and what I think about it. So yeah, I mean, but you know, to be fair to Liquitex, I don't think that's really what they're trying to do. They're not trying to replicate a traditional gouache. So just keep that in mind. It's a new medium. Now, I purchased these about, I don't know, maybe 3 months ago. And I have used them a few times. I haven't used them a huge amount, maybe only 3 or 4 times. So, you know, full disclosure, this demonstration that I will do in a minute, it's not the very first time I've ever used these. I kind of wanted to get a feel for them a little bit before I did this review so that I could give you my honest opinion. And so, yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick little painting with these. I'll probably make it into a time lapse so it doesn't take forever to show you. And then once you've watched that, you can come back and I will give you a review and what I thought was good and bad about these paints while I was using them. Before I go on to give my opinion on these paints, please like the video and comment below if there are any art products that you would like me to review in the future. So now that I've had a chance to test these out, I'm going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons and my opinions on these paint and whether I would recommend them or not. So the good things first, the containers are a really good size. I like the fact that they have this squeezy nozzle. I think that practicality wise, these are much better than tubes because the tubes tend to get clogged up really quickly, especially if you don't cleanly, you know, if you get the paint out cleanly, you leave a little bit around the lid, you put the lid back on, it gets that crusty edge around it. Sometimes that can be really annoying. So these little squeezy bottles are fantastic. and you squeeze them really easily. The paint comes out nice and evenly, and the lid clicks on nice and well too. So the packaging, I love it. Really, really good packaging. The size and the amount that you get for your money is actually really good. However, bear in mind that because these aren't very thick, they are already diluted. I found that I was using a bit more of the paint than what I would normally use with the tubes of gouache. So keep that in mind. The fact that they're slightly bigger amounts of paint justifies that a little bit. You can use more because you kind of need to use more because it is not as thick, but I don't think that's a bad thing. The colors are really, really nice. They're really saturated, really bright. They do mix together really well. So when you're trying to mix colors, as long as you do mix them thoroughly, you won't get any streakiness. You'll get a nice clean matte finish. They do dry really nice and matte. The surface is not sticky at all once it's dry. So you can use these in sketchbooks. Once they're dry, close the pages, and then you'll be able to open the pages up again and your pages won't be stuck together. That's one of the negative sides of using acrylic paint in sketchbooks, for example, because acrylic paint tends to have a bit of a sticky, glossy surface. If you have two paintings on opposite pages and you shut your book, sometimes those pages can stick together. That won't happen with these because they do have a nice matte, not quite, I wouldn't say chalky. Gouache is, traditional gouache is more chalky. I wouldn't say they're chalky, but they're definitely matte. Like you will get a nice no gloss. That's my washing machine beeping in the background. So yeah, the color mixtures are nice and clean. They mix really well. When you paint with them right from the tube, they're very bright. They dry nice and quick. That was another issue that I wasn't quite sure how they would go because they are a part acrylic paint. I was wondering whether it would take a little bit longer for them to dry, but that didn't seem to be a problem. They dried quite well. I also found them to be quite flexible in that I could water them down and do washes and they retained their pigment and retained their brightness. And I could also layer them, which brings me into the negatives or the con list. Although the consistency was lovely in that you can just use them straight out of the bottle and you don't need to dilute with water, I found that to be a bit of a problem sometimes because they really need to be a little bit thicker, especially once you start adding the final layers and touches. You want those to be quite opaque and quite, not impasto, but a little bit thicker. And I found that I couldn't really get that consistency that I wanted. So especially with the white really needed to be a little bit more opaque and a little bit more bulky or thick in order to get those highlights to really stand out. Everything sort of dries a little bit transparent still, even though they're meant to be opaque. All these colors specifically are listed as opaque colors. But I found that most of them were not really totally opaque. They still had quite a bit of transparency to them. And in order to get that really strong opaque look, you kind of need to layer them up, like put at least 2 coats of that color on. And for the way that I'm painting, you know, I don't really mind. If you were doing something that relied on having a nice, thick, matte color laid down, you might find a little bit annoying that they're not quite as opaque as what they say they are. But yeah, so the consistency of the paint was the main issue that I had, was the fact that they maybe, look, to be honest, it could just be because I'm used to painting with gouache out of a tube and being in more control of the amount of water I add to it and the consistency of the paint. So the first few times that I used these, I added way too much water because I was just in the zone and used to using normal gouache, which you have to add water to. And so I just started painting without really paying attention to the fact that you don't need to dilute these. So the first few times I used them, I made them way too watery. Once I realized that I could back off a bit on the water and I had a bit more practice, I got a lot better at it. So keep that in mind the first time that you use them. But even with that in mind, I feel like they're still a little bit too thin. I would like them to be a little bit thicker. So yeah, that's probably really only the negatives that I can think of. So generally speaking, it's a pretty positive review. Would I replace these, or would I replace my Winsor & Newton gouache with these? Probably not. I think that as far as portability goes, these probably aren't as great as tubes. The one thing that I didn't actually test out at all was how well these would handle being left in a container. For example, the gouache that I tend to use, I will squeeze it into a little travel container. And with traditional gouache, because it is not permanent, even when it dries out, you can spritz it with some water and it will reactivate and you can continue to use it. Because these are deemed being permanent once dry, I don't know whether that will happen. I don't know if once they're dry in your palette, they will still reactivate. I actually didn't really test that out very much. So maybe I need to come back and do another review of these later on when I have tested that. But carrying these around in my handbag while I'm out and about sketching on location is probably going to be really impractical. And so I think I would still prefer to use a small palette of regular gouache in that circumstance. But for these in my studio, yeah, I'll probably still use them a fair bit. But yeah, so look, generally speaking, I would say that they're probably more similar to painting with acrylic than gouache. But in Liquitex's defense, they never said that this was to replace gouache. They just said that it's a similar medium to gouache and acrylic that they have created. So yeah, as long as you keep that in mind and you're not trying to replace it, you'll be fine. So my final thoughts, I'd recommend these mostly to artists that have probably never painted with gouache before. If you've never used gouache before and you have no experience whatsoever with gouache, these are actually probably a pretty good place to start because they are, in a way, a lot more similar to acrylic paint than gouache. And so you can use them especially in your sketchbooks or on paper and get a similar look to acrylic paint, and you'll get a nice matte finish. And because they don't need to be diluted that much, you can kind of just start painting and start mixing, and both of those things happen really easily. As far as all the claims that they make in regards to it being no dilution, clean color, matte drying, no cracking, I can say yes to all of those. So yes, they definitely have all those qualities. And so for that, you're definitely getting what they're advertising. So that's a really good thing. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And as I mentioned earlier, I want to do more of these. So if you have any ideas on particular products that you would like to see me demonstrate, talk about, test out, leave a comment and let me know what they are, and I'll do my best to get a hold of them and play around with them and see what I think of them. And thanks for joining me.